You wouldn't expect to hear crying from the roof of a cabin in the middle of the Montana wilderness. Not from children, not from people, and certainly not from wild animals. But that's exactly what happened on the edge of Hyalite Canyon just after the floods came. A neighbor named Lorraine, 71, retired florist mother of 3 widow, was the first to hear it. She told reporters later, "It wasn't just noise, it was pleading." At first, no one believed her. Not even her son, who lived down the hill and assumed the isolation had finally gotten to her. But Lorraine insisted. She'd been feeding birds for 30 years. She knew the difference between a mourning dove, a crying raccoon, and something else. Something wild, something desperate. It had started 3 days before, with a storm that came earlier and stayed longer than anyone in Bozeman expected. The mountains were soaked, the trails disappeared, and the runoff crashed into the valley like it had a score to settle. People were busy sandbagging their homes, rescuing their cats, turning off power. No one had time to wonder what happened to the animals, but they were running too. And that's how a mother bobcat and her 7 tiny cubs ended up stranded on the roof of a cabin that hadn't been lived in since 1996. The mother was later named Sable for her dark coat and silent strength. The cubs, only a few weeks old, were barely big enough to climb, let alone survive a flood. No one saw them make the climb. But at dawn, when the floodwaters were waist-deep around the cabin, they were there huddled close, soaked to the bone, crying. When rescue arrived, the team didn't believe what they were seeing. "I thought it was a family of barn cats at first," said Claire, one of the wildlife volunteers. "But then I saw the ears, the movement, the way she placed herself between us and the cubs. That was no house pet. That was a wild mother holding the line." Sable's eyes never blinked. Her chest heaved, but she didn't move. The cubs clinging to her damp belly stared too. One of them, later named Pip, the smallest, kept trying to climb into her mouth like it was a den. There's something shattering about seeing an animal that's supposed to fear us, ask us for help. Claire wasn't the only one who felt it. One of the firemen on the rescue crew, Adam, a 52-year-old who'd done 3 tours overseas, cried behind his sunglasses. "I've never seen anything that raw," he said. "You grow up hearing stories about bobcats being aggressive. But this was different. This was survival. This was love." To be clear, wild bobcats don't cry out to humans. They don't willingly approach buildings. They don't wait. But Sable did. That moment on the roof changed everything. Not just for Sable and her cubs, but for the people who witnessed it, the town that rallied after, and the thousands who would later watch the rescue unfold on video. Clutching tissues they didn't expect to need. Because this wasn't just a wild animal rescue emotional video. This was a moment where instinct met choice, and Sable, for whatever reason, chose to stay. Lorraine, who kept watching from her window with binoculars whispering prayers, said she felt something ancient click into place that morning. She wasn't supposed to be there, she said, but somehow it felt like she belonged. The cabin itself stood on a slight hill surrounded by ponderosa pines. It was built decades ago by a man who passed before the town expanded. The roof was weathered shingles, chipped, but it held. And on that trembling shelter, a mother bobcat laid down her body to keep her babies from falling in. When Claire approached with her tranquilizer kit, she wasn't sure if she'd need to use it. One wrong move and Sable could bolt, scattering the cubs into the swirling current below. Instead, Sable let out a low, exhausted growl, but didn't move. Claire stopped, slowly crouched. Then she did something she hadn't planned. She took off her gloves. "I wanted her to see my hands," she said later. "I don't know why. It just felt like she needed to see I wasn't hiding anything. And maybe that mattered, maybe it didn't." But after 3 long minutes of stillness, one of the cubs crawled forward, then another. Claire didn't reach for them. She just stayed breathing in sync. Eventually, Sable stood. She turned once, looking at her cubs. Then she walked, limping but proud, straight into the transport crate. And the world stopped. There's no dramatic music in real life. No titles flashing rescue animals or wild animal rescue on screen. But if you ask the people who were there, they'll tell you that was the moment. Not when the boat arrived, not when the crate closed, but the moment she walked in, willingly, with dignity. The lesson wasn't just about survival. It was about surrender. The quiet courage of knowing you can't do it alone. That even the fiercest creatures reach a point where they let someone else carry the weight. It's easy to romanticize nature. We love watching cute animal videos, sharing clips of baby bobcats with giant eyes and twitching tails. But this moment wasn't cute. It was gutting. It was sacred. And in a world that often celebrates domination, this was a rare, clear act of trust. You might wonder what made her do it. Was it exhaustion? Was it instinct, or was it something deeper? Some ancient thread of understanding that still exists between species even when we pretend otherwise. Here's a thought. Maybe animals don't need to be tamed to love. Maybe they just need to feel seen. Sable didn't beg. She didn't bark. She didn't submit. She simply showed up in the open and waited. That's a kind of strength we rarely talk about. And that's what made people cry. Not the rescue, not the flood, but the stillness, the choice, the way this wild cat stared down a human being and didn't run. In the days after the footage of her rescue traveled quickly, shared by hikers, vets, park rangers, watched by grandparents over tea, commented on by people who hadn't cried in years. A retired nurse wrote, "I felt like I was watching a piece of myself get rescued too." And isn't that the real reason we watch these stories? Not just for the animals, but because they remind us of what we still have, what we can still become. As for Sable and her cubs, Scout Rusty Clover, Pip Zephyr Patches, and Juniper, their journey was just beginning. The roof saved their lives, but healing, that would take time. And the people around them, they were about to be changed too. Because in Hyalite Canyon, in a forgotten cabin, no one meant to remember something ancient stirred that morning. A cry echoed across the trees, and someone answered it. Not because they had to, but because they still could. How did Sable end up near people in the first place, and what was her life like before the rain fell? Her past holds more than anyone imagined, including the man who watched it all unfold from behind a lens. Before the rain came, before the crying on the roof, before the flood pulled at the edges of Hyalite Canyon like a forgotten memory, there was silence. Not the empty kind, the alive kind. The kind of silence that hums beneath pine needles when no one's watching. The kind that wraps itself around movement, scent, and instinct. That's the silence Sable knew. She didn't live in it, she was it. No fences needed. She had her range 5 square miles of Montana hillside, dense with chokecherry brush, speckled with rabbit trails, deer scents, fox dens. And for a time, she was alone. Until she wasn't. 7 cubs. That was unusual. Bobcats typically raised 2, maybe 3, but Sable had 7. And she didn't lose a single one. If you ask wildlife experts, they'll tell you that's nearly impossible. But sometimes what's possible isn't what matters. What matters is what she did with it. Sable made her den under a split boulder near a dry creek bed. She lined it with dry grass feathers and tufts of her own fur. Each night, she'd slip out, returning just before dawn with the soft snap of a squirrel or the clean cut of a vole between her teeth. Her cubs, still blind, still learning, would press into her warm and safe. She didn't purr, she didn't coo, but she stayed. Every night, every time. A mile away in a makeshift blind made of branches and old military tarp, a man named Elliot Monroe watched them. Elliot wasn't a hunter. Not anymore. He had once years ago, before his hands started shaking, before he realized he didn't need trophies to prove he belonged in the woods. Now, at 64, with a silver beard and a camera older than some of his friends, he just observed. He never got close, never tried. He respected distance. But one morning, after tracking scat and paw prints through mud, he saw her. Sable, ears up, still, cub in her mouth. She didn't run. She placed the cub down, nuzzled it forward with her nose, and disappeared behind a thicket. The cub followed. That was the first time Elliot felt at what he would later call the tether. A wordless pull that something in that family, that wild cat and her babies, mattered more than a photograph. He started visiting more, always from afar. He kept journals, marked where they roamed, named each cub based on tiny patterns, Rusty with the orange nose, Patches the one who stumbled, Scout the brave one who wandered too far, the others Zephyr, Juniper, Clover, Pip. They were harder to tell apart, but he tried. He watched Sable teach them. She showed them how to stalk not by force, but by demonstration. She showed them how to leap between rocks, how to drink from the edges of frozen water without falling in. Once, she swatted Pip gently for chewing a beetle. Pip stopped chewing beetles. The lessons were subtle, but they were there. One day, Elliot saw Sable pause at the creek bed. She didn't move for a full minute. The water was low, but the clouds above were heavy. Elliot watched her raise her nose, sniff. Then she led the cubs uphill. Later that week, the rain started. We often think of wild animals as reactive, primitive, but that's not the full story. Sometimes they sense what we ignore. Sable's decision to move the den came before a single weather alert. Elliot didn't know this until much later. When the flood maps came out, when people started tracing what had been lost, he realized the spot where the den once was had vanished, ripped out like a page from the land itself. If she hadn't moved them, they'd be gone. And yet she didn't move far, just higher. To an old structure, a cabin no one visited anymore. It was never meant for animals, but maybe it had been once. Maybe it was built by someone who understood that roofs weren't just shelters, they were sanctuaries. And here's the strange part Elliot almost followed. Something tugged at him that morning. The rain had softened. The air was thick but still. He packed up his gear and walked toward the ridge. But just before reaching the cabin, he stopped. There were paw prints in the mud. 7, small, 1 large. Heading up, he turned around. Later, he would wonder why. Maybe he felt he didn't belong at the end of their journey. Maybe something told him they needed to do this part alone. We don't often think of wild animals as making conscious choices. But what if they do? What if Sable wasn't just running from water, but towards something, a memory, a place with a story, an echo? The cabin had once belonged to a ranger who fed strays and built boxes for barn owls. It had stood untouched for 27 years. No heat, no people, just dust and wood. That's where she brought them. We talk about rescue animals like they begin the moment we find them, but Sable's story didn't start on the roof. It started long before, in her silence, in her watching, in her decisions. There's something sacred about that. A mother moving her children through a dying forest. A man sitting still with a camera he forgot to lift. A world about to change, but not yet broken. If there's a lesson here, maybe it's this. Not every battle is loud. Not every hero announces herself. Some protect in silence. Some prepare before the danger arrives. Sable never growled, never charged. She simply led, and her cubs followed. That's not weakness, that's leadership. Some viewers later commented on the rescue video. I wish we knew where she came from. How did she end up there? Why didn't she hide? But maybe that's the wrong question. Maybe the better one is, what kind of world allows a wild animal to trust again? Because the truth is, Sable didn't end up on a roof by accident. She survived because she adapted. She cried not because she was weak, but because she believed someone would answer. And someone did. In the quiet before the flood, a wild family learned what they needed to live. Shelter, scent, siblings, leadership, and maybe, just maybe, the presence of a human who didn't interfere. That kind of respect doesn't make headlines, but it's the foundation of healing. Claire later said, "It felt like we were picking up a story that had already been told. Like Sable had written the beginning, we were just there for the next chapter. And that next chapter would test them all. Because as the rain gathered above and the earth softened below, something was coming. Something that would erase trails, drown creeks, and push every living thing toward choices they weren't ready for. But Sable was ready. She had seen the storm before it came. The flood hits harder than expected. As the earth buckles and the water rises, Sable makes a choice that rewrites everything we thought we knew about wild animal instincts, and Elliot finds himself caught between witness and protector. By the time the emergency alert buzzed on Elliot's phone, the creek wasn't a creek anymore. It was a brown, roaring vein of fury cutting through Hyalite Canyon, taking fences, stones, and stories with it. Bridges groaned, trees tilted. Down the valley, people were already evacuating, but on the ridge above the old ranger's cabin, everything still looked still. That morning, Elliot didn't take his camera. He took his boots and a weatherproof notebook and nothing else. He didn't expect to see the bobcats. Honestly, he didn't expect to see anything. The rain had poured through the night, like it was erasing something. But the ridge dry yesterday was now soaked a soft sponge under his feet. As he climbed higher, he caught the smell of damp, pine-swollen earth and something else, fear. He didn't hear the cries yet. What he saw first was motion. In the field where wildflowers usually bloomed in June, the grass was flattened in a pattern, 7 small paths leading to one larger one. Then he noticed the paw prints again, like the ones from last week. Only this time they weren't heading toward the cabin. They were circling it. Something had changed. At the far end of the clearing, Elliot paused. Through the rain-misted distance, he saw the rooftop. And then he froze. Because right there on the metal roof of the old ranger's home stood a silhouette, low to the ground, ears up, a tail twitching behind. Then another. And another. He counted. 1, 2, 3, 7. Then the mother. It was them, Sable and her cubs, but they weren't moving. Not really. The mother was huddled low, her legs pressed tight under her body. One cub clung to her shoulder like a shadow. Another tried to crawl toward the chimney, slipping slightly. He watched them, not through a lens, but with bare eyes. And suddenly the sound broke through. The cries. They weren't like cat meows. They weren't cute. They were harsh, raw, stretched out like rope. Long, desperate notes that didn't sound like wild animals at all. They sounded like something pleading, something waiting. And that's when Elliot's heart dropped, because he realized they can't get down. The rain had washed out the slope behind the cabin. The steps rotted years ago were gone. The only dry place for half a mile was that roof, and the water was rising. Elliot stepped back and did what he hadn't done in over a decade. He pulled out his phone and called someone for help. He didn't film, he didn't photograph. He just stayed half hidden behind a tree, rain soaking through his jacket, hands clenched, watching a mother bobcat guard her babies from a storm she couldn't outpace. When the rescue team arrived 40 minutes later, they came by ATV and foot. Bozeman Wildlife Emergency had 2 volunteers on standby. Claire was one of them. They expected livestock, maybe a trapped deer. They didn't expect this. At first, they didn't believe Elliot. "Bobcats don't do that," one of them said. But Claire looked through the binoculars and went quiet. She recognized the eyes. In training, they were taught how to read signs of stress in wild animals. Ears flat, shoulders low. Vocalization. What Sable was doing didn't match the textbook. She wasn't stressed. She was alert, focused, in control, but tired. There's a phrase Claire used once when training with a wildlife biologist in Alaska. When survival speaks, instinct listens. What she meant was, this in true emergencies, the wild doesn't act wild. It acts wise. That day, Sable wasn't acting like a predator. She was acting like something else entirely. Something closer to a protector, a caretaker, a mother who had done everything she could and was now trusting the next piece to something larger. The cubs were less certain. One of them, Rusty, kept moving toward the edge, curious and restless. Another, Juniper, huddled between the chimney bricks, silent. The others didn't move. Claire saw the potential for panic. If they moved too fast, startled the group, they'd scatter. Some could fall. The current below was too fast. One wrong foot, and the rescue would turn into tragedy. So she slowed everything down. No nets, no sticks, no tranquilizers. She took off her jacket, approached with a bag of warm cloths and a crate used for foxes. She whispered, not because the bobcats would understand, but because humans tend to forget their volume matters in fragile moments. Elliot watched from behind, tense. The rain had softened to mist now, but the roof was slick. Claire got closer than anyone should have been, and then she waited. Minutes passed. Then Sable shifted. A long, low sound came from her throat, not a growl, more like an exhale. Then, one by one, the cubs moved. First Clover, then Patches, then Pip, into the crate, not all at once, not out of fear, just as if they'd decided together. Sable didn't follow immediately. She circled them once, touched each one with her nose. Then, with a final pause, she stepped in, and Claire closed the crate. There's no word for what that felt like. Relief doesn't cover it. Awe is too distant. Maybe it's something closer to reverence, because what they'd witnessed wasn't just a wild animal rescue. It was a moment of unity between instinct and compassion between species and storms. Later, when the story went online, people began calling it a miracle. Some compared it to animal rescue emotional videos they'd seen baby foxes saved from drains, bears pulled from pools. But this felt different. This felt chosen. One commenter wrote, "It's like she knew exactly what she was doing, like she waited for us." And that's the part that stayed with Elliot the most. Because in all his years of observing wildlife, he'd never seen anything like it. Never seen a wildcat trust the presence of people without flinching. Never seen a mother stare into human eyes and stay. Was it exhaustion? Probably, but exhaustion doesn't make you wait, doesn't make you lead your cubs into a crate one at a time. Maybe it was more than survival. Maybe it was surrender in its strongest form. Because what if the greatest act of strength isn't fighting but letting go? We don't teach that often. In stories about animals, we focus on instincts, hunt, hide, flee. But what if instinct includes recognizing help? What if nature knows how to say, "I've done my part. Now it's your turn"? Sable did everything right. She climbed, she waited, she cried. And when someone finally answered, she didn't run. We like to think we're separate, that wild animals and humans live in different worlds. But maybe that's never been true. Maybe the space between us has always been smaller than we realize. A few steps, a slow breath, a soft voice. That day, under gray skies and wet branches, the canyon held its breath. And something changed. Not just for Sable and her cubs, but for the people who saw them, who responded, who stayed. Because sometimes it's not the storm that defines us. It's what we do when someone calls out from the middle of it. Inside the shelter, healing takes time. While the cubs adapt quickly, Sable shows signs of trauma. What does it mean for a wild animal to carry emotional wounds, and can a human connection truly help her heal? The flood didn't announce itself. It arrived the way most disasters do, quietly at first, with a soft drizzle tapping the cabin roof like it had a right to be there. In Hyalite Canyon, spring storms were nothing new. Locals were used to the low rumble of thunder over the pines and the scent of wet earth that lingered in the fields. But this time it didn't stop. Day turned to night, and the rain stayed. Streams swelled. Hillsides softened. The ground gave way in places no one expected. By the third day, a gentle river near the base of the canyon had become a churning, unrecognizable current. Wildlife, usually hidden deep in the forest, started appearing closer to roads, to cabins, to fences. They were moving, not because they wanted to, but because they had to. At the center of it all, a wild bobcat named Sable made a decision that would leave a town speechless. She could have gone deeper into the forest. She could have tried to outrun the water, but she didn't. Instead, she led her 7 cubs, Scout, Rusty Juniper, Pip Clover, Zephyr, and Patches, up an old slope toward a cabin no one had lived in for years. It wasn't the most obvious shelter, but something about that roof, about the elevation, about the way it stood above the tree line like a lone sentinel, pulled her in. Maybe it wasn't instinct, maybe it was memory, or maybe, just maybe, it was something older than that, something wild animals know without needing to understand. From the base of the ridge, Elliot Munro stood watching. He had come out at first to check on the trail cameras he'd set up to monitor deer movement. But when he saw the creek overtake the footbridge in less than an hour, he knew something bigger was unfolding. Through the fog and slanted rain, he spotted motion on the roof. He raised his binoculars. It was her. Sable. She was crouched near the center, her ears flat. Her tail curled tightly around 3 cubs clinging to her belly. The others stayed close, not moving, barely visible. The cubs weren't crying at first, not loudly. But then, one let out a sharp, ragged mewl, a sound Elliot had never heard from a bobcat before. He froze. It wasn't just a sound. It was a message. That roof was the last dry space they had. Water had risen all around the foundation. The back of the cabin, once shielded by a small hill, had collapsed inward, leaving jagged planks jutting out like broken ribs. The den she'd claimed under the porch was gone, swept out with the mud. Sable had nowhere else to go, and she wasn't leaving. Elliot backed away and pulled out his phone. "This is Munro," he said, voice unsteady. "I need wildlife response. There's a bobcat family stranded on a roof near mile marker 11. They're not running. I think they're waiting." Within the hour, 2 volunteers from the Bozeman Wildlife Emergency Unit arrived. One of them was Claire, a vet tech who'd spent the last 5 years working with injured foxes and coyotes. She wasn't new to floods, but this was different. Wild bobcats don't seek roofs. They don't stay still. They don't cry. When she saw the mother curled up there unmoving, she said softly, "That's not fear. That's a decision." Claire didn't approach right away. She just stood there watching the way Sable shifted her body to shield the cubs from the wind, the way she tilted her head whenever a noise came from below, the way her eyes scanned everything, calculating risk, not in panic, but with focus. It was clear this wasn't just survival. This was instinct meeting intention. There's something unspoken between species when vulnerability is shared. You see it in animal rescue videos all the time when a rescue animal, once broken, looks up at a human with cautious hope. But this was no house pet. This was a wildcat, soaked and shivering, who had every reason to run. And she stayed. Claire moved slowly, unzipping her pack, pulling out blankets, placing the rescue crate in view, but not close. No sudden gestures, no flashlights, no eye contact, just presence. And then came the rain again. A sudden wave of water surged toward the cabin's side, hitting a fallen log and splashing upward. One of the cubs slipped. Sable leapt, dragging it back with her teeth before it reached the edge. That was the moment Claire moved. She knelt in the mud, raised both hands, and whispered, "I can help." She wasn't speaking for the bobcat. She was speaking for herself. The other responder, Mark, a younger volunteer, started to step forward, but Claire stopped him. "Give her time," she said. "She hasn't given up yet." They waited. For nearly 20 minutes, the team watched the roof as the wind howled and the light began to fade. The cubs grew restless, mewling louder. One scout began pacing in small circles. Another pip curled against the chimney. Sable didn't move much, but her eyes never stopped scanning. Finally, something shifted. Sable stood. She stretched her neck toward the crate. Slowly, silently, she stepped forward, just one paw length, then another. She paused, looked at her cubs, and turned back. It was a test, a signal, and somehow the cubs understood. One by one, they began inching toward the crate. Claire didn't speak, didn't move. She just opened the door wider. The first inside was Rusty, then Juniper and Clover. Pip followed, then Zephyr, then Patches. Scout was last. Sable stood back, waited until every single cub was inside. Then she walked in herself, and Claire closed the door. It wasn't the kind of moment you'd expect to go viral. No dramatic music, no overhead drone shot, just a quiet crate in the rain full of life that had chosen to trust. But that clip, 30 seconds grainy handheld, would later move millions to tears. Because it reminded us of something we often forget, that survival isn't always about strength. Sometimes it's about discernment, about knowing when to hold your ground and when to let someone help you. That's what Sable did. She didn't wave a white flag. She didn't surrender her wildness. She made a choice for her cubs, for herself, to step towards something unfamiliar and hope it wouldn't hurt her. And it didn't. That afternoon, Claire rode in the back of the truck with the crate beside her. She kept her hand near the latch, not to open it, but to let them know they weren't alone. She couldn't explain it, but she swore she felt a soft vibration through the metal. A kind of purr, faint, barely there. Maybe it was imagined. Maybe it wasn't. In town, as word spread, people started calling it a miracle. But those closest to it, Claire Elliott, the team called it something else. A reckoning. A reminder that even wild things know when it's time to reach out. That even the fiercest mothers sometimes need help. That vulnerability isn't the opposite of power, it's a form of it. And Sable had given everyone watching a gift. She showed them that the line between animal and human isn't where we think it is. That trust doesn't have to come from tameness. It can come from knowing when enough is enough and having the courage to step forward anyway. The safety of the shelter offers a pause, but not a cure. As the cubs settle in, Sable begins to unravel. What does emotional trauma look like in a wild animal? And how far will one woman go to help her heal? The truck pulled in slow, its tires spitting gravel, the rear doors rattling against the uneven road. Claire sat in the back, one hand resting lightly on the top of the crate that held a mother bobcat and her 7 soaked cubs. She didn't speak. She didn't move. She just listened to the breath inside the crate, the tiny rustles of fur against blanket, the silence of something too tired to cry anymore. They had made it down the ridge across the flooded field and through the winding path into Bozeman's temporary wildlife shelter, set up in an old ranger outpost. But what came next wasn't a celebration. It wasn't relief. It was responsibility. Because helping a wild animal survive the flood is one thing. Helping her trust again, that's something else entirely. Inside the shelter, staff moved quickly. Blankets were warmed, fluids prepared. A separate pen was built out of high-gauge wire in the quietest corner. It wasn't much, just a 10 by 10 space with clean straw heat lamps and a few shallow dishes, but it was dry, warm, and safe, and that had to be enough for now. Claire carried the crate herself. She could feel the weight of it, not just in her arms, but somewhere deeper. As she set it down inside the pen, she glanced through the grate. Sable's eyes met hers. There was no panic, no growl, just observation. The same way a fire watches the room. It's in, not moving, but undeniably alive. Claire opened the crate door and stepped back. No sudden movements, no pressure, just time. The cubs emerged first. Scout always first. Then Rusty slow and cautious. Pip stumbled. Patches climbed over his siblings instead of waiting. Zephyr and Clover stuck close together. Juniper refused to leave the crate at all. Sable waited. Then after several minutes, she walked out. Not with fear, with purpose. She moved through the straw, sniffed the corners, then returned to her cubs. Her body curved around them as if nothing had changed, and for a moment it felt like it hadn't. But Claire knew better. Flood trauma doesn't end when the water recedes. It settles in, quiet, persistent, and for wild animals, the symptoms often go unnoticed until it's too late. Refusal to eat, pacing, sudden aggression, self-injury. They don't have the language to explain what's wrong, only behaviors. And Sable was already showing signs. She barely touched the food. She turned her head when water was brought near. Her ears twitched at every passing footstep. She wouldn't lie down unless her body touched every single cub, as if counting them by contact. Claire documented everything: vital signs, behavior patterns, times of rest. But beyond the charting, she did something else. She sat. She didn't speak to Sable. She didn't try to touch her. She just made herself a part of the room, sitting outside the pen for hours each day, reading from an old paperback or writing in a notebook. Sometimes she just breathed slowly, deliberately, letting Sable learn her rhythm. One afternoon, she placed a glove in the corner of the pen, something soft worn and carrying her scent. Sable ignored it for a day. Then on the second morning, Claire found it beneath the cubs, nestled like bedding. That was the first signal. The second came 3 nights later during a storm. The power flickered, rain slammed the tin roof, pipes rattled, the building moaned with the wind. Inside the pen, the cubs started crying. Claire rushed in. The staff wasn't sure what would happen. No one had ever entered Sable's pen during a thunderstorm. But when she walked in, Sable didn't lunge. She didn't growl. She looked at Claire, blinked once, and stepped back just enough for Claire to kneel by the cubs and place a wool blanket over them. It wasn't a surrender. It was a choice. Compassion in that moment was not a human gift. It was a shared agreement. A quiet understanding between a creature who couldn't speak and a woman who refused to leave. After the storm passed, Claire stayed longer. She cleaned quietly, replaced the bedding, refilled water bowls. She never tried to pet the cubs, never crossed the line. But Sable started moving closer. Sometimes just a step, sometimes more. And in time, something else happened. One morning, Claire walked in to find Sable curled near the fence, her paw resting gently against the mesh wall, inches from where Claire usually sat. It was the smallest gesture, but for an apex predator, it was a profound offering. Rescue people often think is the moment the animal is taken from danger, pulled from water, lifted into a boat, saved. But Claire had seen enough to know better. Real rescue starts when fear begins to dissolve. It starts when a creature that has only ever known solitude starts to believe in companionship. When protection becomes trust. When wild meets compassion and both sides listen. This story, Sable's story, moved people across the country. Not because it was cute, though the cubs were undeniably adorable, tumbling over each other in clumsy plays, nibbling on blankets, pawing at feathers. That's the kind of footage that fills folders of cute animal videos online. But what people really responded to wasn't the cubs. It was the mother. The way she stood on that roof. The way she guarded her cubs through chaos. The way she allowed someone close enough to help. That's what people saw. That's what made them cry. And that's why they stayed. Claire received hundreds of letters, elderly women who had raised children alone, veterans who said the flood brought back their own silent battles, parents who watched with their kids explaining why Sable's courage mattered. Some sent donations, some sent prayers. One sent a hand-stitched blanket with all 8 names embroidered along the border. But not everyone understood. One comment online read, "Why not just release her? She's wild. You're taming her." Claire didn't reply, but she wrote something in her journal that night. Helping isn't taming, it's holding space, letting the wild decide what healing looks like. Sable hadn't become tame. She was still herself, still quiet, still cautious, but she no longer flinched at every movement, no longer hid when voices echoed. She watched, she observed, she adapted. And that Claire knew was the beginning of healing. The cubs, too, began to grow in confidence. Scout led the games. Patches stole food. Pip, always the smallest, insisted on climbing the highest perch. They were thriving. But Sable's recovery wasn't linear. Some days she would stand by the fence watching the rain fall still as stone. Claire could see it in her body muscles, tight tail low. Some part of her was still back there on that roof in that storm. Grief doesn't always roar. Sometimes it whispers, and even a wild cat carries its echo. That's when Claire made a decision. She would stay, not just through the recovery, but for the long haul. She'd seen animals come and go. She'd seen wounds heal, but she'd never seen a mother like Sable. And something about the way this family held together through water, through fire, through silence, made her believe they were meant to teach something more. Because rescue, when done with love, doesn't just change the rescued. It changes the rescuer, too. Days turn into weeks. As the cubs grow stronger, Sable begins to show subtle signs of stress that suggest deeper wounds. With limited resources and difficult choices ahead, Claire must navigate the emotional layers of trauma in wild animals and the fine line between protection and captivity. In the days that followed the rescue, things looked better on paper. Sable was eating again, not much, but enough. The cubs gained weight steadily, their coats beginning to shine. One of the vets even commented that their early survival, given the flood, was nothing short of a miracle. Blood work came back clean. No infections, no broken bones, no parasites. Technically, they were healthy, but numbers can lie. Because even as her body mended, Sable's spirit remained somewhere else. Distant, guarded. She responded to movement with small twitches. She paced, not fast, but with a steady rhythm. She avoided soft bedding, choosing the cold corner of the pen instead. And at night, when the shelter quieted and the cubs fell asleep, she'd sit upright for hours staring at the wall, still, watching something that wasn't there anymore. Claire noticed it first. While the others celebrated small milestones, first play, first full meal the day Rusty climbed the crate alone, Claire watched Sable's eyes. They didn't soften. They didn't close fully. She wasn't sleeping, not really, just surviving. And that was a red flag, because survival is different than healing. You can survive on instinct. You can survive on fear. But to heal, you have to feel safe again, and that wasn't happening. Claire knew the signs. She'd seen them before in rescued animals, especially wild mothers who had lost territory security control. The body comes back quickly. The spirit takes longer. Sometimes it never returns. So she made a decision. She would treat Sable not just as a rescue case, but as a trauma survivor. No formula for that, no textbook. But Claire had her tools, and she started with the smallest one present. Each morning she entered the enclosure not to clean or feed, but to sit. Always the same spot. Legs crossed, palms open, no eye contact, just stillness. She read aloud from a field journal, the same passage every day, about bobcat territory, not because the words mattered, but because the consistency did. Sable didn't respond, not for the first week, but she stopped retreating when Claire entered, stopped flinching when Claire sat. It wasn't progress, not yet, but it was space. Claire kept going. She added scent enrichment, next placing small cloths infused with lavender or cedar wood just outside the cub's reach. Not too close, not overwhelming, just enough to introduce variety in the air. Some days Sable ignored them. Other days she moved them with her nose carefully out of the way. Then came the objects, a feather, a smooth stone, a small mirror. Items introduced one at a time, none threatening, none flashy, just new. And still she waited. The cubs, by contrast, were thriving. Patches had figured out how to open the water dish valve. Pip and Juniper played for hours, mimicking pounces they hadn't yet perfected. Clover was already grooming others like a miniature mother. They had adapted fast, and in a way their joy filled the room with light. But Sable remained in shadow. It was on a Tuesday that Claire saw the shift. She entered the room late. The weather outside had dropped suddenly and frost dusted the windows. The cubs were curled together in the middle of the enclosure, but Sable wasn't in her corner. She was near the gate, sitting, waiting. Claire stepped closer, slowly, and there it was. The glove. The old one Claire had offered weeks ago, now tattered, covered in fur. Sable had moved it back to the gate, and on top of it, a single feather. Not torn, not chewed, just placed there. It wasn't a gift, not in the way people give them. It was a signal, a choice. Claire wrote in her notebook that night, "She's speaking, not in words, but with trust." Trust is never earned all at once, especially not from a wild animal, and not one who's been through a flood. But that moment reminded Claire of something simple. Healing isn't about getting back to normal. It's about learning a new way to feel safe. And safety comes in layers. Actions, repeated choices, respected. Silence, honored. Still, the team faced a hard question. When do you release a wild bobcat back into the wild? The cubs were growing fast. Their instincts were sharp. They practiced stalking each other. They climbed, hid, pounced. All signs said they'd be ready in weeks. But what about their mother? Sable was strong, healthy, but still unsettled. And that created tension. Wildlife policies emphasize minimal human contact. The longer an animal stays, the greater the risk of imprinting, of losing the very wildness they're trying to protect. But Claire pushed back. She's not tame, she told the board. She's aware. She's observing. And she's still choosing the wild every single day. She wasn't wrong. Sable never accepted food from a hand, never allowed touch. She responded to sounds, not names. She protected her cubs fiercely. She hadn't forgotten who she was, but she also hadn't forgotten the flood. Because trauma leaves residue. And for animals, it lives in their bodies, in twitching muscles, and restless pacing in the way they track shadows long after the threat is gone. Claire proposed a middle ground, a transitional enclosure, a semi-wild space outdoors away from the shelter with no people nearby. Just trees, rocks, grass. Let Sable adjust. Let the cubs practice in real soil, real wind. Let them remember who they are. The board hesitated. Budgets were tight. The space needed fencing, monitoring, backup plans. But after weeks of letters from the public, people moved by the bobcat story, people donating quietly, people sharing their own emotional journeys, they approved it. And that's how the Wild Haven enclosure was born. 1 acre. Secluded, natural terrain. No structures, no human voices. The transfer was silent. No cameras, no press. Just Claire and 2 other handlers gently moving the family into crates, driving slowly into the hills and opening the gates. The cubs ran first. Scout leapt into a tree like he'd been waiting all his life. Patches chased his tail in open grass. Pip hesitated, then followed. Sable stayed in the crate. She looked out, eyes scanning everything. The wind, the sky, the scent of freedom. Then, without drama, she stepped out. She didn't run. She walked, not toward the cubs, not away from the humans, just forward. Later that night, Claire sat by the fence just out of view. The sounds of the forest returned: owls calling, wind moving leaves, something unseen crunching pine needles. She didn't need to see Sable to know she was there, because healing doesn't always look like triumph. Sometimes it looks like a step into the unknown, made quietly on your own terms. Claire opened her journal and wrote 1 sentence. She's not just surviving anymore. As Sable adjusts to her new surroundings, an unexpected figure appears, one from her past. When a photograph surfaces and a name is spoken, the story takes a turn no one could have predicted, leading to a reunion shaped by memory loss and the unspoken bond between species. The Wild Haven enclosure was never meant to be permanent. Just a stepping stone, 1 acre of quiet meant to remind Sable and her cubs what it felt like to be wild again. No concrete, no foot traffic, just windbark and the rhythm of open ground. It worked. In the mornings, Scout could be seen perched on a fallen log, scanning the horizon. Patches wrestled Pip in the tall grass. Zephyr and Juniper stalked imaginary prey through dry shrubs, while Rusty, always more cautious, watched from behind a rock. Sable moved through them like a whisper. Protective but patient, present but untouchable. Claire only came in at night, and only to the perimeter. She didn't speak anymore, just sat with a thermos of tea and listened. Her journal pages were filled now, not with data, but questions she couldn't answer. What does a wild animal remember? And what do they choose to forget? She got her first hint. 1 Thursday morning, a school had sent in care packages for the cubs' drawings, little notes, even a laminated poster from a 4th grade class in Missoula. "Thank you for saving the wild cats," one child wrote. "I hope they get to run again." But there was something else in the box. A photo, printed on cheap paper folded at the corners. A grainy image of a man kneeling beside a wooden cabin. Not remarkable at first glance. But Claire recognized the background instantly. It was the same cabin. The one Sable had led her cubs to during the flood. Before it was flooded, before it had become a rooftop refuge. Claire stared at the photo for a long time. The man in it was older, bearded, in a ranger's vest. His hand rested gently on a low wooden railing. On the porch beside him, half in shadow, was a shape. A blur. Possibly a dog. Possibly not. Claire turned the photo over. No writing, no date, nothing. She didn't think much of it until later that week when she visited Elliot. She found him in his garage, sorting old film reels and notebooks. "You recognize this?" she asked, handing him the photo. Elliot adjusted his glasses. His face didn't change, but he didn't blink either. "I took this," he said quietly. "Years ago, maybe 10. That's Walter. He was the forest steward before me. Retired, kept to himself. Who's the animal on the porch?" Elliot hesitated. "That's what we never figured out. It wasn't a dog. Too long in the legs, too narrow in the face. Walter said it just started showing up after a harsh winter. Half-starved. He left out meat scraps and it kept coming back." Claire leaned in. "You think it was her I didn't?" "Until now." They pulled out a magnifier, enhanced the image. It was blurry, but there was no mistaking the shape of the ears, the slant of the shoulders, the wide, wild eyes. It was a bobcat. Sable. As a juvenile. Claire sat back quiet. A chill passed through her, not fear but recognition. Sable hadn't chosen that cabin during the flood at random. She had known it, or remembered it, or something deeper. What was instinct for others had been history for her. Claire called the shelter and asked if they had any record of Walter. A volunteer tracked him down, living 3 towns over, now 82, recovering from surgery. He agreed to a visit. When Claire met Walter, he was sitting on his porch with a cane and a flannel blanket over his knees. He didn't recognize the photo at first. Then he saw the animal beside him. Oh, he smiled. She came every winter, wouldn't come too close, but never missed a meal. "Did you name her?" Claire asked. He chuckled. Didn't dare. "You name something, you get attached." Claire told him the story. The flood, the roof, the rescue, the cubs. When she finished, Walter didn't speak. He just stared at the photo again. Then quietly he said, "She remembered." Sometimes that's all a story needs, a single truth to hold it steady. She remembered, not just the shelter, but the person who once fed her, the porch where she was safe, the place she didn't have to fight for every bite. Walter didn't ask to visit the enclosure, but Claire invited him anyway. 2 weeks later, he came with Elliot. The trail was flat, the day clear. Claire met them at the gate. They didn't go inside, just sat beyond the fence on a bench placed beneath a pine. Walter pulled out a worn baseball cap and set it in his lap. They waited. The cubs appeared first, curious as always. Scout paced along the inside fence. Pip peeked, disappeared, peeked again. Then Sable came. She didn't rush, didn't startle. She moved slowly out from the trees, pausing in the sunlight like she was checking for something. Her ears twitched, her body stilled. She saw them. Claire held her breath. Sable didn't come to the fence, but she didn't run either. She stood for a long moment, then turned just slightly so that her side was visible. Then she looked back, made a soft, low sound Claire had never heard from her before. A sound halfway between a purr and a hum. Walter tipped his hat. "That's her," he said. "I'd know that look anywhere." They stayed for 20 minutes, then left as quietly as they came. No dramatics, no tearful reunion. But something had passed between them, not recognition in the human sense, but something older, something wilder, a memory, a map, a silent thank you. Claire wrote later that night, "Not all reunions are loud. Some are a glance, a pause, a sound you don't expect." And in that silence something healed, because Sable's past wasn't a threat anymore. It had become part of her story. A story that now included survival, motherhood, rescue, and yes, connection. Not just with her cubs, not just with Claire, but with someone from a time when she had nothing but instinct and a half-empty belly. That's what makes rescue animals so powerful to witness. Not just because they survive, but because they carry layers of story we'll never fully understand. And yet they let us close enough to feel it. For Claire, the lesson was simple. Wild animals don't forget kindness. They just don't need it explained. The photo was framed and hung in the shelter office, not as a trophy, but as a reminder that what you give today might echo years from now in ways you'll never see. The cubs are growing fast. The fence that once protected them now feels small. It's time to decide who stays and who goes. As Sable watches her family change again, she faces a new challenge, letting go. By late summer, the air in Hyalite Canyon changed. The scent of wet pine gave way to dust and dry grass. The cubs, once clumsy and timid, now moved like they belonged to the land. They climbed with confidence, stalked each other in silence, vanished into the brush, then reappeared just to show they could. Claire kept her distance. The Wild Haven enclosure was working. It was doing exactly what it was meant to, preparing the family to return to something older than cages, older than caretakers' freedom. But as the cubs grew, the space began to feel smaller. They wanted more than room. They wanted range. The idea of releasing them had always been part of the plan. The cubs would grow. They would strengthen. Then, if they passed the behavioral benchmarks, independence, hunting aptitude, natural fear of humans, they'd be returned to wild territory. Not just open land, but land that could hold them, sustain them, protect them. That was the problem. The original land they'd come from, the cabin ridge, the surrounding forest, the soft banks of the old creek, had been devastated. The flood tore through everything. The trees remained, but the roots had shifted. The animal paths were gone. The prey patterns had changed, and the waterline. It was still unstable. It wasn't a safe home anymore. That realization hit Claire harder than she expected. Because while the cubs were ready to leave their wild home, wasn't ready to take them back. They were in a way orphans. Not of a mother, but of a place. And so the search began. Claire Elliott and a small group of conservationists reached out across the state. Private landowners, Forest Service officials, tribal communities, anyone who had space and the ethics to accept a bobcat family. It took weeks. Finally, they found it, an old stretch of protected woodland in the northern Bitterroot Range, uninhabited, off-limits to hunting, and recently approved for a rewilding program. It wasn't Sable's old land, but it was land that needed life again. It was quiet, thick, rich in prey, and far enough from urban zones to reduce danger. But letting them go wouldn't be simple. The cubs had bonded deeply, not just with each other, but with Sable. Their unity, while beautiful, posed a challenge. In the wild, bobcats are solitary. By the time they reach a year old, they disperse. They claim their own space. They begin to forget the den. These cubs, though, had survived too much together, and it showed. Claire watched them one afternoon, Scout patrolling the edge like a sentinel, Pip following Patches, always a step behind, Zephyr teaching Rusty how to move in the wind's direction. It was more than instinct, it was belonging. So the release plan had to shift. Instead of releasing all 7 at once, they'd split into 2 groups. The strongest, most independent cubs. Scout Zephyr and Patches would be released first. The rest, including the more cautious ones, would stay a little longer, allowing them time to adjust to a slower separation. But what about Sable? She had done her part, raised them through chaos, protected them through flood and recovery. The cubs no longer nursed, they no longer needed her. And yet when Claire watched her in the enclosure, she saw something unspoken, not control, not clinging, but awareness. Sable knew what was coming. The morning of the release, the team worked quietly. No press, no announcement, just 2 trucks, 4 crates, and a dirt road cutting into the forest. Claire rode in the back. Scout and Zephyr were restless. Patches curled up, not asleep, just still. Sable watched them leave. She didn't follow them to the gate. She didn't cry. She simply stood facing the open trees as if measuring the distance between what she had given and what she had to let go. The release itself was simple. The crates opened, the cubs hesitated, then Scout stepped out. One slow step, then another. Zephyr followed. Patches lingered, then bolted, her tail flicking once before she disappeared into the trees. Claire waited, but they didn't come back. And that was the best outcome they could have hoped for. That night, Sable curled up alone for the first time since the rescue. No cubs beside her, no tiny bodies pressing in for warmth, just silence. She didn't sleep much. The next day, she sat by the fence, eyes fixed on the empty ridge. Claire didn't interfere. She knew this part was necessary. Because motherhood, even in the wild, is about knowing when to release. Knowing when survival becomes independence, and when love means letting go. In the following weeks, Sable's behavior changed. Subtle shifts. She stopped sleeping near the center, started scent marking farther out, dug small scrapes into the dirt. Her body language said what her voice never could. She was preparing to reclaim something. Claire met with the board. She made the case Sable was ready too. Not just healthy, not just physically sound, but mentally whole. They agreed. The plan was simple. Wait for the last group of cubs to pass their readiness test, then release them with the Sable in a connected section of the same reserve. A soft exit, no crates, just open gates and choices. But there was one last challenge. Was it ethical to reunite them in the wild? Some said no, bobcats are solitary. Reuniting them could disrupt natural behaviors. But Claire believed otherwise. She wasn't suggesting permanent togetherness, just a chance to say goodbye their way. Because animals don't follow our rules, they follow instinct. And these cubs weren't house pets. They weren't props for cute animal videos or a lesson in sentimentality. They were wild, and they deserved a story that respected that. So the gate opened. Sable stepped out first. No hesitation. She didn't run. She walked into the woods with a calm that made Claire's throat tighten. Behind her, rusty pip clover and juniper followed. Not clinging, just trailing. One by one they vanished into the trees. No goodbyes, no final looks, just the rustle of grass, the whisper of wild. That was the last time Claire saw them together. But a week later, a game cam snapped a photo. 5 bobcats scattered but nearby. The spacing suggested independence. The distance suggested choice. And at the center of the frame, Sable alone. She wasn't leading anymore. She was simply living. The cubs had begun their next chapter, and so had she. Because sometimes reclamation doesn't mean returning to what you had. It means becoming who you're meant to be, even if the land is unfamiliar, even if the home is new, even if everything around you has changed. Claire stood at the edge of the enclosure one last time. The pen was empty now. Quiet. She didn't cry. She just whispered, "Thank you. The forest grows quieter, but Sable's journey isn't over." A storm once again threatens the valley, and this time it's not just water. When memory and fear collide, Claire must decide whether to stay in the background or walk back into the story. It started with one seed, a single wildflower dropped into the damp soil beside the old shelter wall where Sable and her cubs were once kept. Claire didn't plant it on purpose. She had been cleaning out the supply room, found a forgotten packet labeled Montana Meadow Mix, and scattered a few into the wind. She barely thought about it after that. But a week later, something bloomed. Not much, just a little spray of yellow leaning into the light. Still, it caught her attention. She paused, crouched, brushed a thumb against its stem. It was the first new thing to grow there since the flood. She planted more. Soon others joined in. A volunteer brought native grasses. A retired biology teacher from town donated lupine seeds. A child mailed a packet of butterfly milkweed with a crayon note for the cats. And slowly a barren patch of ground, once soaked with fear and floodwater, transformed into something else entirely. A garden. Not the manicured kind, not rows of symmetry or perfection. This was a wild garden, messy and unapologetic, a soft rebellion against what had been lost. Every color, a quiet shout that life was still happening, still pushing through. Claire didn't plan for it to mean anything, but the more she tended it, the more she realized this wasn't just soil and flowers. This was memory. This was healing. This was a place to remember everything the flood had tried to take, because the flood wasn't just water. It was fear. It was separation. It was survival without guarantee. And what Sable and her cubs left behind wasn't just an empty enclosure. It was a reminder that resilience doesn't have to roar. Sometimes it just grows. Visitors began asking about the story. Local hikers would pause at the trailhead where a small sign now stood in honor of a mother who chose to stay. No plaque, no photo, just the words. Those who knew the story understood. Those who didn't could feel it anyway. There's something about a place touched by survival. A feeling you can't name, but you don't want to leave. Claire saw it every day. In the way people slowed down as they passed the flowers. In the way children whispered, even when no one told them to. In the way wildlife returned sparrows, rabbits, even a shy red fox that lingered near the back gate. The story of Sable and her cubs didn't end in the trees. It continued here in the ground that held their footprints. The ground that once shook with rushing water. The ground that had been orphaned and reclaimed. And in that story, Claire found something else. A deeper understanding of what it means to rescue. Because rescuing isn't just about pulling something from danger. It's about what comes next. The waiting, the uncertainty, the rebuilding, the quiet tending of what can't be rushed. That's what the garden taught her. Each bloom carried its own timeline. Some opened quickly. Others took weeks. Some never bloomed at all, but still their roots held the soil unseen but essential. Just like the parts of Sable's healing Claire never got to witness. We often talk about rescue animals in terms of their needs. Food, shelter, safety. But what if we thought about their impact instead? What if every animal we saved also helped save a part of us? That's what Sable did. Without a word, she showed what it means to lead with quiet strength. What it looks like to trust again. What it costs to love and to let go. And somehow that message rippled far beyond Montana. People started writing in from other parts of the country. They'd seen the footage online. A bobcat family on a roof. A woman sitting silently by a fence. A crate opening in the woods. The images weren't dramatic, but they stayed. A woman in Oregon shared how the story helped her process the loss of her sister. A man in Ohio said it reminded him of a childhood dog he never got to say goodbye to. A retired firefighter wrote, "I hadn't cried in 20 years. I did when she walked out of that crate." It wasn't just a viral animal rescue video. It was something else. Something gentler. A mirror. Because when we watch wild animals survive, we don't just root for them. We see ourselves, our own fears, our own instincts, our own hope that when things fall apart, someone will still show up, still listen, still hold the door open. The garden continued to grow. That fall, Claire added a bench. She didn't engrave it, didn't want to make it a monument, just a place to sit, to rest, to remember. Sometimes she'd see someone sitting there alone, head bowed, not crying, just being. And that felt right, because stories like Sable's don't need retelling. They live in the air, in the soil, in the space between what we know and what we feel. One afternoon, as Claire watered a new row of prairie smoke, she looked up and saw a flash of movement on the ridge, just a shape, low, fast gone in an instant. She smiled. Maybe it was nothing. Maybe it was everything. Because life has a way of circling back, not to repeat, but to remind. That what we plant, we don't always get to see grow. But that doesn't mean it wasn't worth planting. And that's the lesson she wants to leave you with. Maybe you're carrying something heavy. Maybe your storm already came. Or maybe it's still on the horizon. Either way, there's a seed in you, waiting, ready, needing light. You don't need to rebuild it all today. Just plant one thing, one act of kindness, one moment of stillness, one step toward trust. The flood may have taken more than water, but the garden gives back. And it starts with you. You didn't have to stay till the end, but you did. And that means more than you know. Super. Thanks is there if you ever want to leave your own quiet mark of gratitude. If this story meant something to you even just a moment, take a second now to reflect. What part of you needs a place to bloom again? What part of your own story are you still waiting to grow? Like this video, if Sable's journey moved you. Subscribe if you want to keep walking paths like these with us. Slowly, gently, one true story at a time. Because here we don't just tell stories, we plant them.